For 52 a.m. over the Strait of Hormuz, the USS Abraham Lincoln does not see the war changing. It hears it first. Not the missile, the impact. A hard metallic concussion under the forward port side that throws coffee off consoles, knocks one sailor into a bulkhead, and turns a carrier built to project American power into the first symbol of how far this war has already gone. Iran had been firing drones. Iran had been firing salvos. Iran had been testing the screen for days. This was different. One missile got through. Not a city, not a base. A U.S. aircraft carrier. And in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Tehran, and in every oil market watching the Strait of Hormuz like a loaded gun, the meaning was instantly clear. This wasn't a warning shot. This wasn't a regional flare-up. This was a direct strike on the floating nerve center of American power in the Gulf. And America's response was not proportional. It was transformational. Hit, like, if you want to see how deep this war goes. February 28th, 2026. Before the carrier strike, before the blockade, before the ceasefire everyone knew would fail, the first wave begins. Operation Epic Fury. That name sounds like branding. It was not branding. It was the opening chapter of the biggest U.S.-Israeli strike campaign against Iran in modern history. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. F-35s, B-2s, cruise missiles, standoff weapons, electronic warfare, cyber suppression, decapitation targeting, command bunkers in Tehran, air defenses around Natanz, missile depots near Kermanshah, naval infrastructure on the Gulf Coast. The goal was not to send a message. The goal was to break the spine of the Iranian war machine before it could stand up and swing back. And somewhere inside those opening hours, the war crossed a line no one could uncross. Ali Khamenei was killed, not isolated, not symbolic, killed in the same opening campaign that shattered the illusion that this would remain another shadow war between Israel and Iran. For years, that shadow war lived through proxies. Hezbollah, the Houthis, militias in Iraq and Syria. Sabotage, assassinations, denial. Now the denial was gone. The supreme leader was dead. The IRGC was bleeding. And Tehran was staring at a regime-level survival crisis before sunrise on day one. Comment strike below if you think that moment made peace impossible. Iran's answer came in layers. That matters, because Iran did not answer America the way Iraq answered in 1991, or Serbia answered in 1999, or even the way Hezbollah answered in 2006. Iran answered as a state that had spent years preparing to fight while losing the sky, so it pushed everything that could still move. Ballistic missiles from hardened launch points, drones from mobile teams, fast boats, naval mines, proxy pressure on Gulf infrastructure, rocket fire through allied networks, and above all, a campaign to make the Strait of Hormuz too dangerous, too expensive, too politically toxic for the West to ignore. That strait is not just geography, it is leverage. About a fifth of global oil and gas trade touches that corridor. If Tehran could not stop American bombers from crossing its airspace, it could still try to stop the world economy from breathing. That was a trade, and for a few days it worked. Insurance costs spiked, ships backed up, markets lurched. Every tanker captain in the region suddenly had to ask the same question: is this cargo worth dying for? The United States understood the threat immediately. CENTCOM did not just prepare for missile defense. It prepared for maritime coercion. Because once Hormuz becomes a battlefield, the war is no longer about Israel and Iran. It becomes about every economy tied to energy, every ally tied to shipping lanes, every government that now has to choose between absorbing pain or confronting Tehran directly. This is why the carrier mattered, not just as a ship, as a statement. The Abraham Lincoln was there to say the sea lane stays open, that American air power still owns the tempo, that Iran can bleed, but it cannot dictate the map. Then came 4:52 a.m. Type yes if you think the ceasefire was doomed from the start. Iran had already claimed hits before. Propaganda is part of modern war. Video clips, state TV animations, missile camera footage that shows fire but not truth. Washington had dismissed earlier claims that Iranian missiles had struck U.S. carriers. This time was harder to dismiss, not because the ship sank. It didn't. Not because the carrier lost flight operations for days. It didn't. But because the missile hit enough. Enough to wound sailors. Enough to scar steel. Enough to prove that saturation, deception, and persistence could still force one round through layered American defenses. And in war, one round is sometimes all it takes to change the political weather. The Pentagon moved fast. Damage control teams sealed compartments. Flight deck crews re-cleared launch cycles. Escort destroyers widened spacing. Air defense doctrine shifted from a high-confidence intercept model to a maximum disruption model. But the real change happened above the tactical level. The White House stopped treating retaliation as one more phase. It started treating it as the central mission. The missile that hit the carrier did not just strike a hull, it struck restraint. By the next targeting cycle, the response package was already being built. This is where the war stopped looking like a punishment campaign and started looking like regime disarmament. New target folders opened. IRGC Naval Command nodes, launcher storage caverns, fuel lines, mine handling points, shipyards, communications relays, drone carrier vessels, coastal batteries, redundant command bunkers. The logic was brutal. If Iran could still launch from it, float from it, transmit from it, or hide under it, it was now part of the kill chain. And America was done trimming branches. It was cutting roots. This wasn't a limited strike. This was regime change by military geometry. Not troops in Tehran. Not a flag over parliament. Something colder. Strip the regime of the tools that make regional war possible. Leave it standing if necessary. But leave it hollow. Hit subscribe if you want the full truth behind Operation Epic Fury. The air war widened. Israel kept pressure on Western Iran and strategic sites tied to missile production and internal security. The United States expanded to naval destruction, long-range strike, and the defense industrial base. Together, they were not simply chasing launchers. They were attacking Iran's ability to regenerate launchers. That distinction explains why the strike count kept climbing. Not dozens, not hundreds. By early April, the campaign had moved past shock and into systematic dismantling. Thousands of targets, more than 2,000 strikes, over 10,000 sorties. The language from Washington shifted too. No longer only about deterrence. Now about ensuring Iran could not reconstitute the military power needed to threaten the region again. That is a language of war aims expanding in real time. Iran's military adapted because it had no choice. Static radar died fast. Runways became traps. Large formations became targets. So the regime dispersed. Launchers under civilian cover. Boats hidden among commercial traffic. Missile teams moving by night. Proxy fire used to stretch the map. And every time Washington claimed degradation, Tehran tried to prove surviving capacity with one more launch, one more explosion, one more headline. That is how weak regimes try to look strong in the middle of strategic collapse. Not by winning, by remaining dangerous. And dangerous they remained, especially in Lebanon. Because while Washington and Tehran were already bleeding each other, Israel and Hezbollah never truly stopped. Southern Lebanon stayed hot. Cross-border strikes continued. Every diplomatic initiative had a second front attached to it. Every ceasefire draft carried a hidden grenade. Tehran said the truce had to include Lebanon. Israel said absolutely not. And that disagreement alone was enough to poison every room where peace was supposedly being discussed. Comment Hormuz if you think control of the Strait mattered more than the nuclear issue. Then came April 8th, the fragile pause, brokered by Pakistan. 2 weeks, that was a number. 2 weeks to stop the freefall. 2 weeks to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. 2 weeks to drag the U.S. and Iran from missile trajectories into negotiations. It sounded significant. It was fragile from the second it was announced, because both sides entered it with opposite definitions of success. Washington wanted Iran to accept hard limits and effectively surrender any route back to a bomb. Tehran wanted reparations, recognition, leverage in Hormuz, and a regional ceasefire that covered Lebanon. Pakistan could bring them to the table. Pakistan could not make them trust each other. And trust was the one commodity this war had fully destroyed. For a few hours, though, The region inhaled. Oil stabilized. Ships tested the lanes. Diplomats spoke in careful verbs. Analysts said off-ramps. Governments said de-escalation. People would watch 6 weeks of missiles over cities and see lanes said maybe. Then the maybe started cracking. Because ceasefires do not fail when leaders sign them. They fail when the battlefield refuses to obey them. Hezbollah fire did not disappear. Israeli strikes in Lebanon did not disappear. Iranian demands over Hormuz did not disappear. American naval posture did not disappear. The war had too many engines still running. And when too many engines are still running, a ceasefire is just a pause between detonations. By April 12th, the Islamabad talks were already exposing the real problem. J.D. Vance led the U.S. delegation. That alone signaled seriousness. High level, direct, no more side channels pretending this was still manageable at arm's length. 21 hours of talks. No deal. Iran refused Washington's terms. Washington refused Iran's conditions. The sticking points were exactly the ones that could restart the war overnight. Nuclear capability, security guarantees, Strait of Hormuz control, regional fronts, Lebanon, reparations, strategic humiliation. In other words, everything. Type talks if you think diplomacy had no real chance. And once those talks failed, the military option came roaring back, with even less political restraint than before. April 13th, the U.S. naval blockade begins. That date matters, because up to that point, the sea battle was about defense and access. After that point, it became coercion. American warships and Marines began enforcing a blockade on Iranian ports tied to the Strait of Hormuz. Warnings, boardings, interceptions. Iranian ships challenged. Cargo vessels stopped. One Iranian-flagged ship seized after U.S. forces said it tried to evade the blockade. Tehran called it piracy. Washington called it enforcement. The world called it escalation. And all of it happened under the shadow of a ceasefire that had not technically expired. That is how absurd this war became. The United States was negotiating with Iran in one theater, while strangling Iranian maritime movement in another. Iran was talking peace while holding leverage over the world's most important oil artery. Israel was speaking of regional security while still hitting Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. Nobody had stopped. They had simply begun talking while still aiming. This is why the carrier strike remains so central, because it explains the American mindset after March. The missile that got through told Washington something it did not want to hear. Iran, even battered, even leaderless at the top, even under relentless air attack, still retained enough coherence to threaten the crown jewels of U.S. deployment. That meant the campaign had not gone far enough. So America went further. B. 2 strikes on hardened sites. Tomahawks into coastal infrastructure. More F-35 hunting of mobile launchers. Persistent ISR. Anti-mine warfare. Drone interceptions at scale. And across 38 days, the campaign grew from opening decapitation to industrial demolition. Like this video, if you want part 2 on the inside story of the blockade. By the White House's own accounting, the operation had achieved its central military objectives in just over a month. Iran's missile arsenal was hammered, its air force effectively grounded, its navy devastated, its defense industrial base ravaged, its command structure fractured, its space and launch infrastructure degraded, its ability to arm proxies sharply reduced. That sounds clinical. On the ground, it looked like exhaustion, power outages, factories gone dark, commanders disappearing, air defense crews running from positions they knew would be geolocated and hit, ports choked, military families waiting for names, and a political system trying to project defiance while surviving what looked increasingly like strategic amputation. Still, Tehran had not collapsed. That matters too, because wars do not end when one side suffers enough. They end when one side accepts terms or loses the ability to resist at all. Iran had suffered enormously, but it still had leverage. Hormuz, residual missile capacity, regional networks, the ability to keep the region nervous, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to wait for Western fatigue. That is why the ceasefire never felt real. Both sides thought time might still improve their position. So nobody gave away the core thing the other side wanted most. For Washington, that was permanent military disablement. For Tehran, that was survival without surrender. For Israel, that was a broader rollback of Iran's proxy architecture. For Hezbollah, survival long enough to remain relevant. For Pakistan, proof mediation could hold. For the markets, just one uninterrupted week without panic. Nobody got exactly what they wanted. Comment Lincoln if you think the carrier strike changed U.S. war aims. And beneath all the communiques, there was another brutal truth. Killing Khamenei did not decapitate the conflict the way planners may have hoped. It detonated it, because removing a supreme leader in the opening hours can paralyze a regime. It can also radicalize every surviving node beneath him. It can create confusion. But confusion in a missile state is not peace. It is decentralization. And decentralization is often more dangerous in the short term. Fewer signatures, looser command, more initiative at lower levels, more chances for one commander, one missile crew, one naval cell to trigger the next spiral. This is why the war felt less stable after the biggest blows, not more stable. The center had been hit, the edges got wilder, and all of that returned us to the image the world could not shake. A U.S. carrier, hit, still afloat, still launching aircraft, still in the fight. That image told Iran it could hurt the giant. It told America the giant could not afford to merely absorb pain. And it told every ally and adversary watching that the old rules of proxy containment were gone. This was direct war now, state against state, with proxies still burning in the margins. That is what makes 2026 different. Not simply the number of strikes, not simply the death of a supreme leader, not simply the blockade. It is the collapse of distance. Israel was no longer just fighting the outer ring. The United States was no longer just backing from offshore. Iran was no longer just answering through middlemen. Everyone stepped into the same battlefield. And once they did, every previous red line started to look imaginary. Type break if you think the ceasefire will collapse completely. So what was America's response to the missile nobody could stop? It was not one explosion. It was a doctrine that said carriers stay forward, sea lanes stay open. Iranian launch capacity gets hunted at every layer. Naval infrastructure gets erased. Diplomacy continues only under maximum pressure. And any strike on high-value American assets becomes justification, not for caution, but for expansion. That doctrine is why the blockade happened. That doctrine is why the strike numbers kept growing. That doctrine is why the war in Lebanon could not be cleanly separated from the war in Iran. Because once Washington concluded that every surviving Iranian lever was part of one integrated threat network, the map fused. Hormuz fused to Beirut. Tehran fused to southern Lebanon. Missile factories fused to shipping lanes. Proxy war fused to direct war. The battlefield became one system. And America answered the carrier strike by attacking the system. That is the real response. Not anger, architecture, not revenge, compression, not one headline-grabbing retaliation. A sustained campaign to make Iran smaller militarily than it had been on February 27th. And by late April, that campaign had done exactly that. But smaller does not mean safe. Weaker does not mean finished. Cornered does not mean controlled. That is the danger now. A regime that has lost prestige, leadership, ships, factories, missiles, and freedom of movement can still choose one final language. Escalation. One more closure threat in Hormuz. One more proxy offensive. One more missile barrage. One more spectacular hit designed to prove survival. And if that happens, this fragile ceasefire won't just break. It will shatter. Share this if you think the Middle East is one strike away from a bigger war. Because the real lesson of the 2026 U.S.-Israel versus Iran war is not that America can destroy faster. Everyone already knew that. It is that destruction does not automatically produce submission. Iran absorbed decapitation and kept firing. The U.S. absorbed a carrier strike and widened the war. Israel kept pressure on Hezbollah even while diplomacy begged for compartmentalization. Pakistan could broker a pause, but not belief. and the Strait of Hormuz remained what it has always been in every serious Gulf crisis, a choke point where military action becomes economic blackmail at global scale. So when people ask whether that missile changed the war, the answer is yes. Not because it sank a carrier. It didn't. Not because it won Iran the campaign. It didn't. But because it killed the last serious argument for a restrained American response. After that hit, Washington was no longer trying to manage the war. It was trying to finish Iran's capacity to wage it. And that is where we are now. A 2-week ceasefire hanging by threads. Failed Islamabad talks behind us. A blockade in force. Lebanon still unstable. Iran weakened, angry and unbroken. The U.S. forward. Israel relentless. The Gulf still one mistake away from ignition. And somewhere in the dark over Hormuz, every radar crew, every missile operator, every bridge watch officer, and every pilot in the stack understands the same thing. The next round may already be loaded. Comment war if you want a next script on how Lebanon could drag this ceasefire into total collapse.